Well, all right, guys, welcome back to our third installment of the kind of the civil rights era, the civil rights discussion. This is page 99 in your packet. This covers civil rights from the late 1800s to mid 1900s. And let's take a look at some of the major events and major things that happened during this time. First thing you have to focus on is Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the landmark Supreme Court cases in our country's history. This happens the same year Utah becomes a state. Now, this is 31 years after the Civil War ends. And so, as we talked about last time, what should have been the rights and freedoms enjoyed by African Americans in those years after the Civil War? They should have been treated equally. They should have had the right to vote, and so forth. But over time, they were denied those rights. Uh, the black codes and voting restrictions severely hampered their ability to enjoy equality, especially in the southern part of the United States. And so what happens is there is a guy named Homer Plessy, 7/8 white, 1/8 black, in a small Louisiana town. And even at 1/8 black, he is considered to be a black man by the laws of the day. And so Louisiana had a law that allowed for separate train cars for blacks and whites to ride on. And Plessy uh, buys a ticket, and tries to get on the whites only train car. He gets denied entrance. And because of this, a lawsuit happens. And so the the idea in question is it constitutional? Is it okay for Louisiana to have these separate train cars? Well, the case gets taken all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1896, the Supreme Court hands down their decision, which rules against Plessy and on the side of the state, saying that it is acceptable for Louisiana to have separate train cars for the different races to ride on, as long as those train cars are equal. And so Louisiana, winning the decision, says, well, hey, if we can have separate train cars, let's have separate other things as well. And soon, southern states in mass follow suit. And pretty soon, you start having separated or segregated just about everything that you can think of in the South when it came to the races. You have separate hotels, drinking fountains, public restrooms, schools, you name it, everything is segregated. Now, those things are supposed to be equal, but rarely were they equal. And thus, this is where we get the separate but equal idea, or the separate but equal doctrine. Starts with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. It will pretty much define civil rights for the next half century at least. And this is going to be the major spot for civil rights activists to fight against. They're fighting against this separate but equal idea. They say, well, there's no way you can have separate but equal things. Having separate things is inherently unequal. And so they will fight against the separate but equal idea for many, many, many years. In 1909, in response to the separate but equal doctrine handed down by the Supreme Court, and then the Southern states' implementation of this doctrine, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, is formed. And really, they have two goals in mind. Number one, end segregation laws. And number two, restore voting rights. We'd already talked about the ways Southern states used to prevent blacks from voting by the late 1800s. And so to get back your voting rights and make a difference at the ballot box and to end these segregation laws are really their principal goals. They will form chapters in just about every city of consequence around the country before long, and they have teams of lawyers and African Americans and white supporters as well work together for the NAACP to try to bring about these changes that they desired. They were usually unsuccessful, especially at first, in their efforts to undo segregation laws and restore voting rights, but they will levy lawsuit after lawsuit. And as the years go on, they make some breakthroughs here and there. but usually they lose, but they don't give up. You can see here that in 1954, now let's fast forward way ahead, over 50 years from Plessy versus Ferguson, and over 40 years from when the NAACP was founded. This map shows public schools and how they were segregated uh, by states. You can see the whole South of the United States required segregation in public schools. The states in the North, most of them prohibited it. Some of the other states allowed it, and therefore it was used at times, not used at times. And then some states like Utah had no specific legislation at all, and so it usually was not used in places like that. But you can see that in the South, it was required. And you talk about, I mean, the all the kids that this affected, all the people that it affected, and so absolutely, the public schools were were the area that segregation affected the most people in the United States on a daily basis. The public school segregation issue was also the number one source of the lawsuits that the NAACP issued over the years. And like I said, they pretty much lost all of them, but over time they gained a little traction and had some wins, minor wins, but never able to undo the segregation itself. Now, if you look at Kansas, right in the middle of the country there, segregation was allowed in Kansas, and Kansas did use it. And that's going to be ground zero for the fight over segregation in public schools in 1954, which we'll look at right now. That fight occurred with the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education. The family on the left, the Brown family, and the girl on the far left, Linda Brown, is at the center of this lawsuit. Linda Brown and her family lived in Topeka, Kansas, and Linda lived basically right across the street from a school, but it was a whites only school. Her blacks only school was much further away. And her dad said, "Hey, my daughter's as good as anybody else. She should be able to go to this school across the street from our house." The NAACP agreed, and a team of lawyers, the best team of lawyers they had, led by the man in the middle there on the picture on the right, his name was Thurgood Marshall. They took the case and fought this all the way to the Supreme Court. As a side note, Thurgood Marshall uh, is one of the best lawyers overall in the United States at the time and would later become the first black Supreme Court justice in the United States of America. Now, by 1954, enough of the Supreme Court members had changed over throughout the years that most of those justices that ruled against the NAACP and against the integration of schools over the years, those justices pretty much were gone by this time. And a new crop of justices sat on the Supreme Court. And by 1954, with this case, they finally come to their senses and rule in favor of integrating public schools. They say that segregation has no place in education and in the public schools, and therefore they rule as of 1954 that all public schools must be integrated, and that is the new law. Some schools that had been segregated integrated pretty much immediately. Some schools resisted for a little while, and some schools resisted for a long time. Some states and school districts in particular said, no, we're not going to integrate until we're forced to do so. And so that basically had to be the way that they finally did comply with the law, was that they were forced to integrate. But you can see here, these are certain ways, some ways, that states tried to avoid school integration. And as you go down the list, the measures get more extreme. Uh, White citizens councils, groups of people who just try to come up with ways to, avoid integration, try to come up with different reasons why integration should not occur. To token integration, which we'll look at in depth in just a second. Token integration is just allowing a few black students at a time into a school, hoping that they will be intimidated and decide not to stay. Number three, some states and districts allowed white students to attend private schools with state financial support. Now, we know private schools are not to be funded by the public taxpayer, they're to be funded by private donations and by the tuition of the students who go to those schools. But some places allowed whites to go to private schools on the taxpayer dollar and therefore avoid integration. Some places also, number four, had student placement laws involving placement tests that they would require African American students that wanted to get into a school to take. These tests were extremely difficult. Most people could not pass them. And therefore they said, well, we gave you a shot, but you couldn't pass the test, therefore you can't get in. And then number five, the most drastic measure of all, some school districts closed schools entirely. They just said, nope, rather than integrate, we will just not have school. If you can imagine that. I mean, talk about crazy. But these are ways that some states just tried to avoid integrating after the Brown versus the Board decision in 1954. Well, one of those states that tried to avoid integration was Arkansas. And in Little Rock, in particular, one of their high schools called Central High was one of the biggest and academically best schools in the country. And Central High School and Arkansas had avoided integration for 3 years. And when 1957 rolls around, just before the school year starts, the NAACP in Little Rock and the civil rights movement, if you will, insisted that black students be given a chance to go to Central High. And the governor, although he had resisted integrating, said, okay, fine, we will do some token integration. We'll let 9 black students go to Central High School, and we will pick these 9 students. And so the kids were kind of interviewed and they were chosen to go to Central High School. You can see on the picture on the left there are 10 people there because the lady that's standing up second in from the right is named Daisy Bates. She was an adult woman who was the head of the NAACP in Little Rock, and she really helps the kids in their quest to go to Central High School. So these 9 students are ready to go to start the 1957 school year. And just before the first day, the governor of Arkansas gets on TV and says, oh, no, we've had a change of plans. These kids are not going to be safe at Central High. They are not going to be allowed to go to school on the first day. And so we're going to put the National Guard out in front of the school and prevent them from getting in. And so that's exactly what happens. The students, undeterred, still showed up on the first day. They tried to get into the high school and they were blocked by the National Guard. Now, the white students were able to attend, of course, but these 9 black students, the Little Rock 9, as they are called, were not allowed in. And word of this eventually reaches President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the White House. And Eisenhower was pretty upset at what the governor of Arkansas had done. And so Eisenhower said, okay, you want to play tough? We will. Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army to escort these kids to school. So the 101st Airborne picked up these kids at their houses, drove them to school, walked into school with them, walked through the halls with them, and if need be, attended class with them to make sure these kids were safe. And so Eisenhower and the federal government win in this contest with the state of Arkansas over the integration of Central High. Now, these 9 kids, of course, are going to be at the center of this controversy, and some of the kids at Central High School liked them there. Some of them were mean to them, and some of the kids I think were probably a little indifferent. But unfortunately, the 101st Airborne doesn't stay forever. In fact, they only stay for a short time. And when they leave, now these 9 kids are left on their own. And there were some racial incidents, and there were some really hard times. Many of you have read the book Warriors Don't Cry by Melba Beals. She is one of the students in the Little Rock 9, and she wrote that book about her experiences at Central High during this year of 1957 and 58. Now, there was one senior among the Little Rock 9. All the rest were juniors and sophomores. And the senior was Ernest Green. And Ernest Green did, in fact, graduate from Central High at the end of the school year in mid 1958. Of the 9 kids, 8 of them stuck it out through the whole school year. One of the girls was tired of all the incidents occurring, and she moved in with I believe, a sister of hers in another state and she had got a scholarship to attend a private school in a different state. So she took advantage of that and went. But 8 out of the 9 stayed and blazed the trail for other African American students to eventually attend Central High and for integration to occur in Little Rock, Arkansas. These kids are heroes. I mean, they showed that, amazing things can be done if you're willing to sacrifice, if you're willing to persevere, and you certainly have to have a lot of courage. And these kids definitely had that. By the mid 1950s, Martin Luther King Jr. had taken over kind of as the face of the civil rights movement. And, he will go down, of course, as a legend uh, in U.S. history for that. He was a pastor, a preacher, who led what was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And this was not necessarily a conference like we think of, like a 1 or 2 day work conference or something like that. This conference was more permanent, and it was African Americans and white supporters as well. It was preachers, pastors, other city officials, anybody that wanted to be part of the cause. And these guys did marches and protests and boycotts and so forth. And Martin Luther King became their spokesman and the face of the movement. And so it's this group that's going to be instrumental in organizing in the different cities throughout the South, uh, where the civil rights movement will uh, will play a major role in trying to achieve equality once and for all. Now, the thing Martin Luther King Jr. preached above all else was the nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience that his followers needed to live by in order to make a difference. Uh, King played upon the ideas of people like Gandhi of India and of Jesus. Uh, they said, you stand up for what you believe is right. You you're going to be unpopular at times doing that, but you have to stand up for your beliefs. And sometimes in doing so, you might break the laws of the land, but you have to do so in a peaceful way. You don't fight back. You don't let your fists do your talking. You just disobey laws you feel are unjust, but you do so peacefully. You might get beaten up, you might get arrested. If you do, you take it. King's idea was and philosophy was, uh, if you're the one getting beaten on for just standing there and you're not fighting back, eventually people will support your cause. Now, your natural instinct is to fight back, but King also knew that the civil rights movement and the actions of its followers would be in newspapers. Pictures would be in papers. There would be television footage of what happened to them. So he knew that if they were fighting back, that would be looked down upon by the majority of the population. Whereas if they were protesting peacefully and being hauled off to jail and being smacked over the head with nightsticks by police officers for just marching down a street in protest or just minding their own business, then people around the country would look at that and say, hey, wait a minute here, we got to make some changes. This is not acceptable in today's America. And that's exactly what happened. And so his nonviolent direct action, his civil disobedience ideas really, took hold among the civil rights activists. That's how they did things. That's how they conducted themselves. And it worked. Eventually, they got enough support that Americans across the country were saying, hey, wait a minute here, Congress. You've got to do something. You've got to do something to intervene and restore people's equality and freedoms, right now. And eventually they did.